This video contains a fictional story created exclusively for entertainment and inspiration. This content is not intended for educational purposes. The narrative is original and was developed by a human creator with the support of artificial intelligence tools and creative review. No real events or historical facts are being presented as true. There are moments in a life that arrive without warning, not announced by any particular shift in the weather or any tremor in the ordinary rhythm of the day, but simply there, sudden and complete, like a door opened onto a room you did not know existed. You cannot prepare for such moments. You cannot reason your way around them afterward. You can only carry them carefully, the way one carries something fragile through a house full of sharp corners, and hope that the carrying does not cost you more than you can afford to lose. I have lived long enough to know that the most consequential things rarely announce themselves. The morning that changes everything looks from the outside exactly like every other morning. The garden where a life turns on its axis is just a garden. Old stones, quiet water, the smell of late-season flowers warming in the afternoon sun, and the two people standing in it, looking at each other for the very first time, have no idea at all what has just begun. This is the story of Rosemary Whitfield, and of the man who fell in love with her before he knew her name. Wiltshire in the early autumn was the kind of place that made a person believe, however briefly, that the world was fundamentally well ordered. The light at that time of year had a particular quality, slanted and golden and unhurried, that softened even the most angular things and gave the landscape the appearance of a painting that had been executed with great affection and no deadline whatsoever. The hedgerows along the country lanes were still heavy with late berries, and the fields had the settled look of harvested things, satisfied and still. It was a countryside that had been beautiful for centuries and intended to remain so. Into this landscape, Rosemary Whitfield fit with the natural ease of something that belonged there. She was 22 years old in the autumn of which I speak, the daughter of a family whose name carried more history than fortune, respectable, well-regarded, the kind of English family that had stood in the same county for so many generations that their roots and the roots of the land itself had become difficult to distinguish. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet stubbornness, and she had cultivated, over the course of her young life, a composure that most people mistook for reserve, and that was in fact something considerably more interesting. A deeply attentive intelligence that preferred to listen before it spoke and observe before it concluded. She was not the kind of woman who sought admiration. She was, rather, the kind of woman who earned it without trying, and sometimes without noticing. Men in drawing rooms found themselves speaking more carefully in her presence, not because she intimidated them, but because her quality of attention made careless speech feel like a waste of something precious. Women who met her once remembered her afterward with a fondness they could not quite explain. She had the particular gift of making people feel, in her company, that they were more interesting than they had previously supposed. She was also, as of 6 months prior to the afternoon in question, engaged to be married. His name was Edward Blackthorne, and he was the kind of man who entered a room and made it immediately warmer. A lieutenant in the British Army, broad-shouldered and easy in his manner, with a laugh that arrived quickly and a generosity that was entirely uncontrived. He had met Rosemary at a supper held by mutual acquaintances in the early spring, and he had distinguished himself from the other men present by the simple and radical act of asking her a question and then waiting, genuinely waiting, for the answer. They had spoken for an hour that evening, moving from the subject of the supper itself to the question of whether Dickens had been better served by his earlier novels or his later ones, which was the kind of conversation Rosemary generally had only with herself. She had come away from it thinking that Edward Blackthorne was, whatever else he might be, a man who did not consider the interior life of a woman an inconvenient mystery best left unexplored. The courtship that followed was pleasant and sincere. Edward called regularly, wrote letters that were warm without being excessive, and treated her family with the specific combination of respect and ease that made everyone comfortable without making anyone feel managed. Rosemary's mother approved of him almost immediately, which was not a small thing. Her father, more measured in his assessments, took 3 months to arrive at the same conclusion, and then arrived there firmly. And Rosemary. Rosemary found in Edward something she had not expected to find so early in her life, someone whose company she genuinely enjoyed, whose goodness she trusted without effort, and whose feeling for her was steady and transparent and entirely without game. It was not, she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge, the wild and consuming passion of novels. But she had always been somewhat suspicious of that variety of feeling, which seemed, in the literature she had read, to cause considerably more suffering than joy. What she and Edward had was real and warm, and built on a foundation of mutual respect, and she genuinely believed, that it was the right material from which to construct a life. When he asked her, on a Tuesday evening in May, with the apple blossoms going quietly mad outside the Whitfield drawing-room window, whether she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, she had said yes, with a sincerity that came from the deepest part of her considered self. There was one thing in the months that followed that had not yet come to pass. She had never met Edward's elder brother. Theodore Blackthorne, Duke of Aldenmere, existed in Rosemary's understanding of her future life as a figure heard of but not encountered, rather like a significant landmark described in a travel account that one has not yet had occasion to visit. Edward spoke of him often, and always with a particular note in his voice that sat somewhere between pride and deference, the way a man speaks of someone he genuinely admires and has never quite caught up to. "You will like Theodore," Edward had said on more than one occasion. "He is not easy to know, perhaps not at first, but there is no one more trustworthy, no one whose word means more." From these accounts, Rosemary had assembled an impression, a man of considerable restraint and considerable substance, shaped by responsibility in the way that eldest sons of ancient families are always shaped, by the weight of inheritance and expectation bearing down on every decision from earliest childhood. A man who thought carefully and spoke rarely, and had learned, through necessity, to keep his own counsel even in the presence of those closest to him. She had also gathered that Theodore had been, for much of the preceding 2 years, occupied with the management of Blackthorne properties in the north, and with matters of some political significance that Edward described only in the vaguest terms, either because he did not know the details, or because he had been asked not to share them. Whatever the particulars, the effect had been that Theodore's time in London and Wiltshire had been limited, and the introduction between him and his brothers intended had been repeatedly, if not deliberately, deferred. It was now October, and Theodore was finally coming home. Edward had arranged a luncheon at the Blackthorne estate, an occasion meant to celebrate his brother's return, to gather the family and several close acquaintances, and to accomplish at last the introduction that had waited 6 months for its moment. He was openly excited about it in the cheerful, uncomplicated way that was characteristic of him, speaking of it at every opportunity and expressing his certainty that Rosemary and Theodore would take to each other immediately. Rosemary had smiled and agreed that she looked forward to it and felt in the private recesses of her mind a mild and quite reasonable curiosity about the man she was, in some technical sense, about to acquire as a brother. She could not have known, nobody could have known, least of all her, that the afternoon would not proceed as planned, that the introduction Edward had imagined so carefully, with its proper setting and its proper witnesses, and its appropriate social scaffolding, would be preceded by some 30 minutes by something else entirely. Something that would cost them both, in different ways, a great deal more than they were prepared to pay. The Blackthorne estate in October was a serious kind of beautiful, not the exuberant, colour-drunk beauty of the summer gardens, but something quieter and more considered. The great oaks along the drive still holding the last of their amber, the lawns deep green under a sky that couldn't quite commit to either cloud or clarity, the house itself rising from the landscape with the gravity of something that had stood there long enough to become part of the earth's intention. It was the kind of place that made a person instinctively lower their voice, not from intimidation, but from respect. Rosemary had arrived early with her mother, as planned. Edward had written that he would be slightly delayed by a matter requiring his attention in the village, and that they should go ahead and make themselves comfortable with the other guests already assembled. The house was lively in that specific way of English country gatherings, conversation drifting from the entrance hall, the smell of good food coming from somewhere deeper in the building, the sound of gravel under feet as people moved between the house and the gardens in the pleasant October air. Her mother had been absorbed almost immediately into conversation with an acquaintance near the drawing-room door, and Rosemary had excused herself with the ease of someone who has learned to navigate social occasions on her own terms. She was not unfriendly. She had spoken briefly and pleasantly with 2 or 3 people she recognized, but the accumulated warmth of enclosed spaces and formal conversation had, after half an hour, created in her the familiar, specific need for a few minutes of open air and the particular quality of silence that outdoor spaces provide. She slipped out through a side door that opened onto a path leading down toward the lower garden and the lake. The afternoon met her gently. The air was cool and held the faint mineral smell of water and turned leaves, and the light through the oaks was the particular amber of late October afternoons that always made her feel, in a way she could not have articulated, as though she were standing inside a painting of itself. She followed the path without particular destination, her hands folded before her, her thoughts settling the way thoughts do when the body is in motion and the immediate social demands of the world have temporarily receded. The garden was largely empty at this hour. Most of the guests had remained closer to the house. She walked past a low stone wall covered in the rust-red remnants of summer climbing roses, past a sundial that had stopped recording time some decades ago and now simply stood among the lavender as a piece of beautiful, useless evidence of someone's optimism, and along the path that curved toward the lake. It was there at the edge of the garden, where the formal plantings gave way to a wilder margin of long grass and old willows trailing their fingers in the still water, that she saw him. He was standing with his back partially toward her, looking out over the lake with the focused stillness of a man who was not merely passing time, but thinking, genuinely thinking, the kind that requires a body held quiet and a mind allowed to work without interruption. He was tall, with the upright bearing of someone for whom it was not a performance, but simply a habit of self. His coat was dark and well made, and there was something about the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of their stillness, that suggested a person accustomed to carrying weight without letting it show. She stopped. She was not sure in that first moment why she stopped. It was not precisely caution, not precisely curiosity, but something between the two. An instinctive recognition that the stillness of this person was the kind that ought not to be disrupted carelessly. He turned then, as though he had sensed her presence rather than heard it, and their eyes met across the 10 or 12 feet of garden path that separated them. He was perhaps 32, she thought, or close to it. His face was lean and precisely featured, with the kind of lines around the eyes that come not from age, but from years of looking carefully at difficult things. There was nothing showy about him, no calculated charm in his expression, no social performance in his posture. He simply looked at her with the same directness that he had, a moment before, been directing at the lake, as if she, like the water and the willows and the amber sky above them, was simply a thing worth looking at honestly. She felt something she could not name. Not attraction precisely, or not only that, something more disorienting, more complete, a sensation of sudden clarity, as if something that had been slightly out of focus had, without any adjustment on her part, resolved itself into sharpness. She was aware, in a way that was entirely new and entirely unwelcome, of the precise distance between them. "I beg your pardon," she said, because the silence had lasted a moment longer than convention strictly allowed, and she was, above all things, a woman who knew how to manage a moment. "I didn't realize anyone was here. I was looking for a little quiet." "As was I," he said. His voice was low and measured, with a quality of deliberateness to it that she recognized as the voice of someone who does not speak without meaning to. "It appears we had the same idea." "The house is rather full," she offered. "It is," he agreed, "which is, I'm told, a sign of a successful occasion." There was a dryness to this that was not unfriendly, more the dryness of someone who finds the world's performances faintly amusing without being contemptuous of them. She found herself, despite herself, wanting to smile. "You sound as though you are not entirely certain of that." He looked at her for a moment, with something that might, in a different face, have been surprise. "I sound as though I have been to a great many successful occasions," he said. and have found that they are better in retrospect than in the moment. She did smile then, briefly and entirely against her better instincts. They spoke for some minutes after that, about the garden and the age of the oaks along the drive and the particular quality of October light that made everything look slightly more significant than it probably was. It was the conversation of two strangers who have discovered unexpectedly that they speak the same interior language, careful but not guarded, precise but not cold. He asked what had brought her away from the house, and she told him honestly that she had needed air, and he nodded as if this were the most reasonable thing one could need. He did not ask her name, and she did not ask his. There was somehow an understanding between them that the conversation was complete in itself, belonging to the afternoon and the garden and the still surface of the lake, and that names were a thing that belonged to the world they had both, for these few minutes, stepped away from. She noticed that he did not look at her the way most men of her acquaintance looked at her, assessing her value, calculating her position, composing their impression of her in relation to themselves. He simply looked with that clear and level attention, as if she were interesting in and of herself, entirely apart from any use she might be to anyone. She had not realized until this moment how rarely she had experienced that. Later, much later, when she would try to account for what happened to her in those minutes by the lake, she would come back again and again to this, that it was not a single thing. It was not his face or his voice, or the particular way he held himself in the cool October air. It was the quality of being genuinely seen, unhurriedly and without agenda, by someone whose eyes told her that what they saw was worth looking at. She was not a woman given to impulse or carelessness. She had built her life on careful feeling and considered thought. And yet in those minutes, something had moved in her that was entirely outside her careful architecture, deep and quiet and irreversible, like a shift in the ground beneath a building that the building itself does not yet know about. She was recalled from this dangerous territory by the sound of footsteps on the gravel path behind them, and a voice she knew as well as her own heartbeat. "There you both are. I had a feeling the garden would claim you both before luncheon." Edward came down the path with his coat slightly windswept and his smile fully deployed, that open, generous, entirely characteristic smile that had always made rooms feel safer. He moved with the easy confidence of a man arriving exactly where he wished to be, completely unaware that he was walking into a silence that had been, for the past several minutes, anything but empty. He came to stand beside Rosemary, and the naturalness of his positioning there, beside her as her intended, as the man whose name she bore in all the legal and social instruments of their shared future, arrived like a cold, clarifying wind. "I see you found each other without my help," Edward said cheerfully, looking between them with transparent pleasure, "though I suppose I should do this properly." He turned to the man by the lake with the pride of someone presenting something he has worked hard to acquire. "Theodore, this is Rosemary Whitfield, my fiancée." The word fell into the afternoon like a stone into still water. Fiancé, Theodore Blackthorne. Duke of Aldenmere, elder brother, the man who had spent the last several minutes looking at her as though she were the most interesting person the garden had produced, went entirely, completely still. It was a stillness of a different quality from the one she had found him in. That had been the stillness of contemplation. This was the stillness of a man absorbing something that has struck him somewhere vital, containing the impact through nothing but will, and the long practice of showing the world precisely as much of himself as he has decided it ought to see. It lasted no longer than 2 seconds. 3 at the most. Then he bowed. Correctly, precisely, with all the formal grace of his position and upbringing. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was entirely controlled. "Edward has spoken of you with great warmth. I am very glad to meet you at last." She curtsied. She said something appropriate. She could not afterward have told you exactly what, only that it was suitable and composed and gave nothing away. Edward, arm in arm with her now, was speaking about the luncheon and the guests inside, and something about a horse he wanted Theodore to look at before the afternoon was done, his voice warm and continuous and completely, blessedly unaware. And Rosemary looked for just one moment at Theodore Blackthorne, at the man who now wore with perfect precision the expression of a brother welcoming a future sister into the family. And she understood, with a certainty that arrived like a sentence already completed, that something had already happened between them that could never be made to unhappen. That the garden and the lake and the amber October light had witnessed something that would cost them both, in ways neither of them could yet fully see, an enormous price. Edward guided her back toward the house, talking all the while. Behind them Theodore fell into step and said nothing, and his silence, to the one person there who could read it, said everything. There is a particular kind of torment that polite society invented without meaning to, the torment of proximity, of being required by the ordinary machinery of family and obligation and social calendar to sit across a dinner table from the one person whose presence undoes, quietly and completely, every careful arrangement you have made of yourself, to pass the salt, to comment on the weather, to laugh at the appropriate moments and look away at the appropriate moments and perform, with the discipline of someone diffusing something dangerous, the perfectly ordinary role that the world has assigned you, all while carrying, in the place behind your sternum where the unacknowledged things live, something that has no name and no acceptable expression and absolutely no intention of resolving itself into anything convenient. Theodore Blackthorne had always been a disciplined man. He had been formed by discipline the way certain metals are formed by heat, not broken by it but fundamentally altered, made into something harder and more precise and more capable of bearing weight than the original material had been. He had learned discipline early, as eldest sons of ancient families invariably do, in the particular school of expectation that begins in childhood and never quite lets out. He had applied it to his education, to the management of his estates, to the navigation of the political currents that ran beneath the surface of English society in those years like underground rivers, powerful and invisible and capable, if you forgot they were there, of pulling you somewhere you had no intention of going. He had never, in 32 years, had significant cause to apply it to his own heart. Until October. Until a garden and a lake, and the amber light of a late afternoon, and a woman standing on a gravel path who had looked at him with dark eyes that saw clearly and asked nothing in return for the seeing. He had ridden back to the estate that evening after the luncheon, through lanes that were losing their light rapidly in the way of October evenings, the sky going from gold to rose to the deep, clear navy of a country night, with a speed that always surprised him, no matter how many times he had witnessed it. He had ridden and thought and arrived at nothing useful, and thought some more. By the time he stabled his horse and walked to the house, he had reached the only conclusion available to him. It was nothing. It was a moment, singular and unfortunate in its timing, of the kind that happened to people and meant nothing beyond itself, provided they were sensible about it. He had met a woman in a garden. He had found her interesting. The world was not short of interesting women, and a man of his age and position and supposed self-governance had no business allowing a 30-minute conversation by a lake to acquire any significance whatsoever. She was his brother's fiancée. The thought was a door closed firmly. He closed it, turned away from it, and went to bed. He lay awake for 2 hours. The weeks that followed had a surface of perfect normalcy that Theodore maintained with a craftsman's attention to detail. He attended to his correspondence and his estate accounts. He met with his steward about the winter preparations for the North properties. He wrote 3 letters to political associates in London and received 4 in return. He rode every morning in the early light, which was growing thinner and colder as November approached, and he found that physical exertion helped, not with the thinking, but with the particular restlessness that had settled into him since October, like a low-grade fever that never quite broke. He saw Rosemary twice in those first weeks, at family occasions that were inescapable, once at a supper held at the house of a mutual acquaintance, once at a Sunday luncheon organized by his mother, who had taken to Rosemary with the decisive warmth of a woman who had long been hoping Edward would exercise better judgment than she had privately feared he was capable of. Both occasions were civilized and entirely correct, and Theodore navigated them with the precision of a man who has given considerable prior thought to navigation. He was, on both occasions, pleasant, friendly even, in the measured way that was natural to him, He spoke to Rosemary as he would speak to any young woman of good family who was about to enter his family circle, with courtesy and a certain careful warmth, calibrated to make her comfortable without crossing any of the invisible lines that he was, with great vigilance, keeping clearly marked in his own mind. She, for her part, was composed in a way that he suspected cost her something, though he could not have said precisely how he knew that. She was unfailingly gracious, always appropriate, and managed the particular difficulty of their situation, the knowledge that they shared, unspoken, of those 30 minutes by the lake, of the conversation that had preceded Edward's arrival, with a grace that he found against his better intentions remarkable. She never referenced it. He never referenced it. Between them, in the space where that afternoon lived, there existed a mutual and absolute silence that was, in its own way, the most articulate communication he had experienced in years. Edward noticed nothing. This was not a criticism of Edward, who was a good man and a loving brother and entirely genuine in everything he did. It was simply that Edward perceived the world, as warm-natured and open people sometimes do, somewhat in the manner of a man walking through a beautiful landscape in bright sunshine. He saw the beauty clearly and the shadows not at all. He was delighted that Rosemary and Theodore appeared to get along so well. He said so on more than one occasion, with complete sincerity. Theodore agreed that yes, they got along very well, and thanked God for the long practice of keeping his face exactly as he intended it. It was in November, at a dinner held at Blackthorn House, that Theodore understood for the first time the true dimension of what he was dealing with. It had been an ordinary evening by every external measure. 15 or so guests around a well-set table, the kind of dinner that the English country gentry had been producing for centuries with the reliable efficiency of a tradition that had long since worked out all its difficulties. The food was good, the wine was appropriate, the conversation moved through the standard channels of local news and national politics, and the reliable English fallback of the weather. Rosemary had been seated, by the accident of the table arrangement, directly across from him. This was not ideal. He had, in the careful geography of his inner life, established that proximity at a manageable distance was navigable. Across a room, perfectly manageable. At the same table but several seats removed, navigable with attention. Directly across, where the candlelight fell on her face and her voice carried clearly to him whenever she spoke, and her eyes, in the course of the ordinary movements of dinner conversation, met his with the uncalculated regularity of two people seated opposite each other for 2 hours. This was a different category of situation entirely, and he had not adequately prepared for it. She was speaking to the woman seated beside her, his cousin, Margaret, who was easy and talkative and had drawn Rosemary into a conversation about a novel they had both recently read. Rosemary was animated in a way he had only glimpsed once before, in the garden, in those minutes before the world had reassembled itself into its proper order. She had opinions about the novel, strong ones expressed with the particular energy of someone who has been thinking about something carefully and found, unexpectedly, a person worth thinking aloud to. Her hands moved slightly as she spoke, which he had not noticed before, a small eloquence of gesture that was entirely unconscious and entirely her. He looked away, attended to the conversation on his right, made 2 or 3 contributions that were, he was reasonably certain, coherent, looked back. She was laughing at something Margaret had said, not the careful social laugh that women in drawing rooms produce on cue, but a real one, brief and unguarded, the kind that changes the whole face and disappears before it can be performed. It was gone in a moment. She recovered her composure immediately, in the way of someone long accustomed to monitoring herself in company. But he had seen it, and something in his chest did something that he had absolutely no language for and no interest in examining. He reached for his wine glass with the deliberateness of a man performing a neutral action, and he thought, with the cold clarity that had always been his most reliable tool, "You are in considerably more difficulty than you have been acknowledging." The thought was not comfortable. He sat with it anyway because he was not a man who benefited from looking away from uncomfortable truths, and because the truth, uncomfortable as it was, had the significant advantage of being the truth. He was not merely charmed. He was not merely interested in the way that any sensible person might be interested in an intelligent and gracious woman. He was, and the word arrived in his mind with the weight of something that had been building pressure for weeks and had finally found the crack through which to come through, drawn to her, in the deep and inconvenient way that had nothing to do with reason or timing or the basic decency of a man who loved his brother and would sooner remove his own hand than cause Edward harm. He set his wine glass down. Across the table, Rosemary glanced up, caught his eye for the fraction of a second that was the full extent of what either of them allowed, and looked away. He thought, she knows. He thought, of course she knows. He thought, God help us both. And then he turned to the man on his left and asked with perfect composure what he made of the new proposals regarding the Northern Railway. The winter passed. They saw each other with the regularity that the incorporation of Rosemary into the family's social life demanded, and they managed it. This was the word Theodore used privately for what they did, because it was accurate, and because accuracy was a thing he valued even when it was unkind. They managed it the way one manages a complicated thing that cannot be simplified, with constant attention, with care taken at every point where care was required, and with an absolute mutual commitment to a surface of complete and appropriate normalcy. They were never alone together. This was not accidental. Theodore ensured it with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that temptation is best addressed at the point of opportunity rather than at the point of temptation itself. And if Rosemary noticed the care with which he maintained that boundary, and he suspected, with the instinct of someone paying very close attention, that she did, she honored it with an equal and answering care that he found perversely more moving than any declaration could have been, because it told him something. It told him that she understood what was at stake, that she too was carrying something, and that she had made the same decision he had made, to carry it in silence, to manage it with everything she had, and to give Edward, who deserved nothing less, the full and undivided presence of the woman he was going to marry. There were moments in those winter months when Theodore allowed himself, very briefly, in the private hours of early morning before the household woke, or in the last minutes of a long ride across the frozen north pasture with no one else in sight, to simply acknowledge what he felt, without trying to diminish it or dismantle it, not to indulge it, only to know it, the way one knows a landscape one is passing through and will not return to. He told himself that time would change it. That familiarity, and the settled reality of Edward's marriage, and the ordinary accumulation of other concerns, would gradually reduce it to something manageable, something he could file away in the category of things felt and not acted upon, which was, in a long life, a category that all decent people found occasion to add to. He was, in this expectation, both right and entirely wrong. Right, because time did change it. Wrong, about the direction of the change. The wedding was held in March, when the Wiltshire countryside was doing its annual tentative experiment with spring. Crocuses along the church path, bare branches beginning their slow suggestion of leaf, the air not yet warm, but no longer committed to cold. The church was old and small, and smelled of stone and candle wax and the particular damp holiness of buildings that have hosted the full range of human occasion for several centuries. Theodore stood at the front of the church beside Edward as his best man, in the position that the structure of his love for his brother had always required him to occupy, present, supportive, the fixed point around which the other's life organized itself. He stood straight and still and watched Edward's face as the doors at the back of the church opened. Edward's expression in that moment was something Theodore would remember for the rest of his life. It was the expression of a man whose certainty about the rightness of his life had, in one instant, been converted from an abstract belief into a physical reality that he could see walking toward him, pure and uncomplicated and entirely genuine. The expression of a man who did not have complicated feelings about the woman coming down the aisle, who simply, wholeheartedly loved her. Theodore looked at his brother's face, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Gratitude. Not the bitter kind, not the kind that cost something to produce. Real gratitude for the fact that Edward was capable of that expression, that the woman walking down the aisle would be received by a man who looked at her like that. Then he looked at Rosemary. She was composed. Of course she was composed, and it was in every way her defining quality, the thing she wore over everything else, the way a building wears its exterior stone, and there was beauty in it, and strength. But Theodore, who had spent 5 months learning to read the specific language of her composure, saw what was underneath it. A woman walking toward a life she had genuinely chosen, with a sincerity that was real, even if it was not the whole of what she felt. He looked forward. He stood still. He performed his role with every ounce of the discipline he possessed. The vows were exchanged. Edward's voice was warm and steady and full. Rosemary's voice was clear and perfectly composed and gave nothing away. Theodore said, "I witnessed this. I was present. I did what was right." He said it to himself, in the private interior where these things are said, and he believed it, and it was enough. It had to be enough. The year that followed was the year of ordinary life resumed. Edward returned to his regiment in the spring, his military obligations requiring his extended absence from Wiltshire, and Rosemary remained, by the practical arrangement of their life together, largely at the Blackthorn estate, close to his family, well provided for, embedded in the social fabric of the county, in the way of a young married woman in her first year of established life. Theodore was present intermittently. His own obligations took him frequently to the north and to London. But the Blackthorn estate was his ancestral home, and there were months in which it was simply inevitable that they occupied the same house, ate at the same table, moved through the same rooms. They had by this point developed between them a way of being in each other's company that was, to any external observer, the entirely unremarkable warmth of a man and his brother's wife. They discussed books. She had opinions that were worth discussing, and he had opinions that she disagreed with on a regular basis, with a precision that he found genuinely enjoyable. They spoke about the estate, the gardens, the household. He told her once about the North properties, and she asked questions that told him she had been listening to Edward's accounts of them with more attention than Edward had probably realized. She was interested in things. She read widely and thought carefully, and had the rare quality of being able to change her mind when presented with a compelling argument, which she did without embarrassment, and which he found in a world full of people who confused stubbornness for strength, quietly extraordinary. They were in this way becoming, he was careful about the word, careful about everything, friends, something real and genuine, and built on the actual substance of who they each were, not on proximity or the hothouse atmosphere of unacknowledged feeling. He was glad of it. He was also, in the honestly accounted ledger of his inner life, aware that it made things both better and considerably more complicated. Because friendship, true friendship of the kind that is built on real knowing, is its own kind of attachment. And the thing he felt for Rosemary, which he had been managing with such careful discipline, did not diminish in the presence of genuine friendship. It deepened. It became less like a fire that needed containing, and more like a stone at the center of him, permanent and quiet and entirely beyond the reach of management. He accepted this. He did not like it. But he accepted it, because acceptance was the only honest available position, and because dishonesty about one's own interior was, in his experience, the source of a very particular and very preventable species of suffering. Edward came home on leave in the autumn, full of energy and stories and the specific vitality of a man who finds his purpose in the active life. He was well, visibly well, lean and sunburned and genuinely happy in the way that outdoor life and clear purpose seemed always to produce in him. He brought Rosemary a silk scarf from a market in a city Theodore had never visited, and presented it to her with the uncomplicated delight of someone who had been imagining the giving of it for months. She wrapped it around her hands and said it was beautiful, and her voice was warm with something that was real. Theodore heard it, knew it, and he was glad, genuinely glad. He watched them together during those 2 weeks of Edward's leave, and felt more than anything the specific relief of confirmed rightness. Whatever he himself carried, whatever the stone at the center of him felt like in quiet hours, this, Edward's happiness, Rosemary's genuine warmth toward the man she had married, this was the correct arrangement of the world, and it was good. Edward left on a Tuesday morning in November, in the thin grey light of a day that couldn't manage anything more than a reluctant drizzle. He embraced Rosemary at length. He shook Theodore's hand with both of his, in the way he had always done, and said, as he always said when they parted, that he would be back before they had time to miss him properly. Theodore watched the carriage until it was gone. He did not know, standing in the drizzle on the front steps of the house where they had both grown up, that it was the last time he would ever shake that hand. The letter came 2 weeks later. It was a Tuesday again. Theodore would note this afterward, with the irrational significance that grief attaches to irrelevant details, as if the day of the week were somehow responsible. The letter came from Edward's commanding officer, written with the careful, formal regret of a man who has written too many such letters, and has not found a way to make them easier by the doing of it. Lieutenant Edward Blackthorne had been killed on the 15th. A mine, in a field that had been supposed to be cleared. He had died immediately, the letter said, which was the one mercy available to offer. Theodore read it once. Then he sat in his study, in the chair where he had sat to read 1,000 letters before it, and he did not move for a very long time. He thought about a boy running ahead of him on the Blackthorne Drive. Too fast, always too fast, turning back with that grin that dared the world to keep up with him. He thought about the particular pitch of Edward's laugh, which had always been the kind of laugh that made other people laugh without knowing why. He thought about the expression on his brother's face at the front of a church in March, and the absolute, uncomplicated certainty in it. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. He sat. He was still sitting there when one of the household staff found him, an hour later, and it was only then that he realized he had been crying. Not dramatically, not with the visible performance of grief, but quietly and continuously, the way deep things grieve from somewhere below the reach of dignity or control. He had to tell Rosemary. That was the thought that reached him through everything else, sharp and clarifying. She does not yet know, and I have to be the one to tell her. He rose. He gathered himself, the whole long-practiced machinery of self-governance, which had never felt so inadequate and never been so necessary. He walked down the corridor toward the east sitting room where she spent her mornings. He opened the door. She looked up from her book with a smile that was reflexive and entirely unguarded, the smile of a woman in her own home who has nothing in that moment to protect herself from. It lasted 1 second. Then she saw his face. The book fell from her hands, though she did not notice it. "Theodore," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "What has happened?" It was not a question. She already knew, in the way that people sometimes know the worst before they are told it, from the particular quality of a person's stillness, and the specific look in their eyes of someone carrying something they wish with everything they had, they did not have to carry. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair beside her, which was Edward's chair, which would now always be Edward's chair. He took her hands in his, the first time he had ever touched her hands, her cold and suddenly trembling hands, and he told her. She did not cry immediately. She sat very still in the way she had always sat when composure was the only available shelter, and she listened to everything he said, and then she was quiet for a long time. He held her hands throughout. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that was adequate to the moment, and he had always understood that the attempt to fill unbearable silences with words was a kindness to the speaker rather than the listener. When she finally wept, it was with a completeness that told him everything about the grief, that it was real, that it was deep, that whatever complicated truth had lived in her alongside her marriage to Edward, her love for him had been genuine, and the loss of him was a genuine wound. He sat with her. He did not leave. He was present in the only way available to him, fully, quietly, without condition. Outside the east window, the November rain came down steadily on the garden where they had never, after that first afternoon, been alone together. The old oaks held their last few leaves against the grey sky with the stubbornness of things not yet ready to let go. Inside, Theodore held his brother's widow's hands and felt the weight of everything that was true and everything that was impossible and everything that lay, unresolvable and patient, somewhere in the space between them, waiting for a future that neither of them could yet see or name or allow themselves to imagine. He stayed until she asked him to leave so that she might be alone. He rose. He released her hands. At the door, he stopped. "I am here," he said, simply, completely. "Whatever you need, I am here." She looked at him from across the room with red-rimmed eyes, and the expression of someone who is, in the very same moment, utterly broken, and somehow, inexplicably, not entirely alone. She nodded once. He left. And the rain came down on the garden, and the oaks held their last leaves, and the house absorbed, as old houses do, the particular grief of the people within its walls. Quietly, without comment, with the patience of something that has seen this before, and knows, even when the people inside cannot possibly know, that this is not where the story ends. Part 3. What remains? When everything else is gone. Grief, in the great houses of England, had its own particular grammar. There were rules to it, not written anywhere, not recited aloud, but understood by everyone who moved within those walls with the thoroughness of things absorbed rather than learned. Black was worn for a prescribed period, and then half black, and then gradually, carefully, colour returned to the wardrobe, as colour eventually returns to a landscape after winter, tentatively, in small measures, as if asking permission. Calls were received, and then, after a time, made. Society, which had retreated to a respectful distance, drew gradually closer again, like tide returning to a shore it had temporarily abandoned, and life, ordinary, persistent, entirely indifferent to the magnitude of what had been lost, continued its forward motion, whether one was prepared for that motion or not. Rosemary moved through those first months with the same composure she had always carried, and Theodore, who had spent the better part of a year learning to read beneath that composure, understood that this was not coldness or indifference, but the particular courage of a woman who had learned early and repeatedly that life does not pause for grief, and that one must therefore find a way to carry grief without being carried by it. She did not perform her mourning. That was what he noticed most in those grey winter months, the absence of performance. She wore her black and received the condolence calls, and said the appropriate things with the appropriate expression, but in the private hours of the household, when the formal requirements of bereavement had been set aside for the evening, and it was only family, only the people who had actually loved Edward, she was simply herself, quiet sometimes, with the particular quietness of someone whose mind is occupied with something real, occasionally undone, briefly and completely by something small and unexpected. A book Edward had left with his name written in the front, a pair of riding gloves forgotten in the entrance hall, the specific way a particular chair sat angled toward the fireplace, because he had always moved it that way and no one had moved it back. On these occasions, Theodore did not offer remedies or reassurances. He had learned that first afternoon in the East sitting room that she neither needed nor wanted to be rescued from her grief. What she needed, and what he was able to offer with an honesty that cost him nothing because it was simply true, was presence. The quiet, unconditional kind. He was there. That was all. And it was, in ways he had not anticipated, enough. Winter moved toward spring with the slow, reluctant pace of a season that knows it is being replaced. February brought a week of unexpected warmth, the kind that arrives in the middle of winter like a rumor, not quite believed, gone before it can be properly appreciated, and then retreated into a cold that felt, by contrast, sharper than it had before the warmth. March arrived grey and purposeful, and with it came the first anniversary of the wedding that had taken place in a small church on a morning of tentative crocuses, and Rosemary spent that day quietly in her rooms, and Theodore left her entirely undisturbed, and the house observed its own silence in the way of houses that have always understood more than the people in them give them credit for. By April, something had begun to shift, not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to and named, but in the accumulated, incremental way that real changes always occur. The black began to lighten, fractionally. Rosemary came down to dinner with more regularity. She began, cautiously, to re-engage with the broader life of the estate, consulting with the housekeeper about the spring household management, walking in the gardens again with the particular attention of someone reclaiming a relationship with a place she had temporarily withdrawn from. She wrote letters that were about things other than bereavement. She borrowed a new novel from the library and left it, half read and annotated in the margins in her small, precise hand, on the table in the East sitting room. Theodore found it there one morning, and stood for a moment looking at the annotations, which were exactly what he would have expected them to be. Sharp, occasionally impatient with the author, twice genuinely funny. He smiled at the margin of a page in a way that no one saw, and set the book back down and went about his morning. He was still being careful. He intended to go on being careful indefinitely, not because he had any illusions about the permanence of what he felt or any expectation that time would ultimately diminish it, but because the calendar of proper conduct was clear and his respect for it was genuine, and because Rosemary deserved, above everything, the protection of his discretion. She had lost her husband. She was in her first year of widowhood. Whatever the complicated truth of what had lived between them before Edward's death, this was not the time, and might not be for a very long time, for anything other than the quiet, honorable support of a man who had made a promise to his brother that did not end with his brother's life. He asked nothing of her. He expected nothing. He was present and useful, and occasionally carefully made her laugh, and he considered this sufficient work for the foreseeable future. What he had not accounted for, what his careful planning had in its very thoroughness failed to include, was Rosemary herself. It was a morning in late April, close to a year since Edward had gone, when she came to find him. He was in the library, the Blackthorn Library, which was large and slightly disordered in the way of libraries that are actually used, the shelves not perfectly aligned, certain volumes lying horizontal on top of upright ones, the leather chairs angled toward the windows in the manner of furniture that has been moved by actual people seeking actual light rather than arranged for appearances. He was at the writing table with the estate correspondence, and he heard her knock at the open door and looked up. She was dressed in grey, not mourning black, but the quiet grey of transition, of a woman moving carefully from one season of her life toward the next. Her dark eyes were clear, and she had the expression he had come to know as her thinking expression, the one that meant she had been working something out and had arrived at a position she intended to hold. "May I speak with you?" she said. "Of course." He set down his pen. "Come in." She came in, but she did not sit. She remained standing near the window, and the April light fell across her with the particular gentleness of that month, which is always more forgiving than the months on either side of it. She looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was so unguarded, so stripped of the careful composure she normally wore in his presence, that he felt it like a physical thing. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want to say it plainly, because I have spent a very long time being careful about everything, and I find that I have run out of patience with caution." He waited. "I know what the proper period is," she said. "I know what is expected of me, and what is considered appropriate, and what society will say at whatever point in the future I choose to rejoin it as something other than a widow in mourning. I know all of this, and I am not dismissing it." She folded her hands in front of her, not in the managed way she sometimes did, but simply as if she needed something to do with them. "But I have also been doing a great deal of thinking about Edward and about everything. And there is something I need to say to you, and I need to say it now while I still have the nerve." He said nothing. The library was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a wood pigeon was producing its repetitive, meditative commentary on the morning. "I know that you have been careful," she said. "I know how deliberate you have been since the beginning, about every boundary, every line. I have seen it. I have been grateful for it more than you know, because it made it possible for me to be in this house and in this family with something approaching integrity." She looked at him directly. "I also know that I am not imagining what has been true between us. I am not inventing it, and I am not dramatizing it, and I am not a woman who mistakes kindness for something more than it is. I know the difference." The wood pigeon continued its observation of the morning with total indifference to the conversation inside. "I loved Edward," she said, and her voice shifted when she said it, became something more tender and more sorrowful. "I want you to know that I mean that truly, without qualification. He was a good man, and I was genuinely grateful for him, and the loss of him is real and will remain real. I am not standing here because I have tidied up my grief into a convenient conclusion. I am standing here because grief and what I need to say to you are two separate things, and I have finally understood that conflating them is not honesty. It is only a more sophisticated form of avoidance. Theodore was very still. "I have been in love with you," she said quietly, "since a garden in October. I did not choose it. I have spent the better part of 2 years managing it with everything I had, because it was the only decent thing to do. I am not ashamed of having managed it. I am proud of it, actually." A brief, clear expression crossed her face that was not quite a smile and was not quite pain. "But Edward is gone, and I am telling you the truth, and I need you to know it. Not because I am asking anything of you, not because I expect anything in return, but because I am so extraordinarily tired of carrying it in silence, and because if I don't say it now, I think I will go on not saying it for the rest of my life, and that seems—" She paused, searching for the word with the precision she always brought to language, wasteful. The silence that followed was of a different quality from every silence that had come before between them. It was not the silence of things suppressed or managed or contained. It was the silence of something that has been said, finally and completely, and is now simply present in the room. Real, irreducible, waiting. Theodore rose from his chair. He crossed the room in the unhurried way of a man who has waited a very long time and has finally been released from the waiting. And when he stopped before her, he was close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. He looked at her, that full, clear, level attention that had been from the very beginning the thing most difficult to bear and most impossible to look away from. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since a Tuesday in October, when you were standing on a path by a lake in my own garden, and you told me, with complete composure, that you had come outside because you needed air, as though this were a perfectly sufficient explanation, and you had no interest in offering more." His voice was low and entirely steady. "I have spent 2 years doing the only decent thing available to me. I would do it again, the same way, because it was right. But I need you to understand that the doing of it cost me everything I had." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright, and her composure, that remarkable and faithful composure, had finally, for the first time in the 2 years he had known her, simply let her go. "I know," she said. "I saw." He reached up and took her face in his hands with the careful tenderness of someone handling something that has already survived a great deal and deserves, at long last, to be held gently. "Rosemary," he said. Just her name. Only that. But the way he said it, with the weight of 2 years of silence behind it, with the full measure of everything that had never been said in all the dinners and the drawing rooms and the long winter evenings, with the simple and absolute honesty of a man who has finally put down the thing he has been carrying, it was more than a declaration. It was a homecoming. She placed her hands over his. Outside, entirely without irony, the wood pigeon continued its meditative monologue about the April morning. The light through the library windows was clear and warm, and entirely indifferent to the significance of what was happening beneath it, in the way of light, which has always refused to treat certain moments as more important than others, and in so doing makes all moments equally luminous. What followed was not swift. That was perhaps the most important thing to understand about what came next, that neither of them was in a hurry, and that the absence of hurry was itself a form of respect, for Edward, for the life that had been lived, for the grief that was real and ongoing, and did not simply conclude because something new had begun. They did not rush toward a future. They moved toward it the way careful people move toward important things, with attention, with deliberateness, with the willingness to let each step be what it was before taking the next. They talked, more openly than they had ever been able to talk before, and the freedom of it was something neither had entirely anticipated, the specific relief of 2 people who have been translating their every word for years, finally being able to speak in their own language without the labor of translation. He told her about the North, about the years of managing properties that were largely unfamiliar to him, and the particular loneliness of responsibility without intimacy, the constant presence of people, and the constant absence of anyone who knew him. He told her about the political work, which she listened to with the focused interest that she gave everything, and asked questions that made him reconsider things he had thought settled. She told him about her childhood in Wiltshire, about her mother's particular intelligence, and the shape of the loss of her, about the years of learning to need very little outwardly because the inward life had always been rich enough to compensate. She told him about the essay she had once written and never sent, about the opinions she had accumulated over years of careful reading and had had until very recently nowhere adequate to put. He listened to all of it with the attention that had always been his most disarming quality, the quality that said, "What you say matters, and I am not going anywhere." Summer came to the Blackthorn estate with its usual extravagance, and they walked in the garden that had by this point accumulated so much significance between them that moving through it felt like moving through a place that had its own memory. They walked past the willows by the lake, and past the stone wall of old roses, and along the path where it had all begun on an October afternoon that had seemed, from the outside, entirely ordinary. They did not hurry. It was Theodore who finally addressed the question of the future, on an August evening when the garden was at its most full-throated, and the light had that deep amber quality that felt, as it always did in late summer, like the world attempting to make peace with its own impermanence. They were sitting on the low stone bench near the lake, the same bench, as it happened, that he had been standing near on the afternoon they met, though neither of them commented on this, because some symmetries are better honored by acknowledgement than by speech. "I want to speak to your father," he said, "when you are ready, not before. But I want you to know that is my intention." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the lake's surface where the evening light was conducting a slow, elaborate performance of its own reflection. "There will be talk," she said. It was not an objection. It was simply the honest naming of a true thing. "There will be," he agreed. "People will have views. Some of them will be unkind. And you are prepared for that." He looked at her with the directness that she had loved, quietly and without permission, since the first morning she had seen it directed at a stretch of still water. "I have spent 2 years being prepared for considerably worse," he said. "I think I can manage the views of people who were not present for any of this and will not trouble to understand it." She looked back at him for a long moment. Then she said, with the clear and unornamented honesty that was, he had long since decided, one of the finest things about her, "I am ready." Sir Aldous Whitfield received the Duke of Aldenmere in his study on a September morning, and the conversation that took place there was, by both men's accounts to their respective confidants, not a comfortable one in its early stages. Sir Aldous was a man who had loved his daughter practically, and sometimes clumsily but always genuinely, and the proposal before him required him to hold several complicated things simultaneously: his grief for a young man he had respected, his protectiveness toward a daughter who had already lost a great deal, and the evidence visible to anyone who had paid attention that Rosemary Whitfield was more fully and quietly alive when Theodore Blackthorn was in a room than she had ever been at any other time. He sat with all of this for a long moment. Then he said, in the tone of a man who has arrived at a position through genuine thought rather than mere compliance, "She has chosen this of her own accord?" "Completely and entirely," Theodore said. "And you are a man who will see her clearly," Sir Aldous said. It was not quite a question. "I have been seeing her clearly," Theodore said, "for 2 years. I do not anticipate any difficulty continuing to do so." Sir Aldous looked at him for a long moment, with the assessing expression of a father who has learned, sometimes the hard way, that the best available evidence about a man's character is the way he speaks of the woman he loves when he believes no performance is required. What he saw in Theodore Blackthorn's face in that moment was nothing performed. It was simply the truth, plainly held. He gave his consent. They were married in the following spring, not in the small Wiltshire church which belonged to a different chapter, but in the chapel on the Blackthorn estate, which was old and plain and had the quality of a place that had been used honestly rather than decoratively over the centuries. There were no grand festivities. The occasion was intimate by the standards of a ducal wedding, family and a few close friends, and the quiet ceremony of 2 people making a promise that both of them had, in truth, been keeping for considerably longer than the morning it was formally made. There was no performance in it. That was the thing that struck everyone present afterward when they tried to describe it, the specific absence of spectacle. What there was instead was something harder to articulate and more difficult to forget. The quality of 2 people fully present to what they were doing, fully attending to each other and to the weight of what they were saying, with the seriousness of those who understand that a promise made before God and before the people one loves is not a ceremony, but a commitment that will require everything you have, on ordinary days as well as extraordinary ones. Rosemary wore pale gold, not white, not the colors of a first spring, but the color of something that has traveled through seasons and emerged with its warmth intact. She walked down the aisle with her father, who was visibly moved and doing his considerable best not to show it, and Theodore watched her come toward him with the expression that had been, from the very beginning, his most unguarded and his most revealing. Not the elevated emotion of performance, but the quiet, deep, entirely genuine recognition of a man looking at the person who is, in all the ways that matter, home. She reached him. He took her hand that he had held once before, in a sitting room on a November morning when he had been the bearer of the worst news either of them had ever received, and that he had thought then he might never hold again under any other circumstances. He held it now. The chaplain began. The chaplain. Outside the chapel windows, the Blackthorn estate was doing what it did in April, announcing with characteristic lack of restraint that winter was finished and the world intended to be beautiful again. The old oaks along the drive were in the first tentative haze of leaf. The garden held the specific, promising disarray of early spring, everything beginning at once, the air carrying the clean mineral smell of wet earth and growing things. Somewhere in the grounds, the lake reflected a sky that had finally, after a long winter, decided to be blue. The vows were exchanged. Theodore's voice, when he made his promise, was low and clear, and carried the weight of every year that had preceded this morning, the discipline and the silence and the long, honest carrying of something too real to be diminished and too decent to be acted upon before the world allowed it. He said his promise with everything behind it, every word full. Rosemary's voice, when she made hers, had the quality of a woman who has thought carefully about every syllable, and means each one with the precision of a person who does not speak without intention. She looked at him as she spoke, and in her dark eyes was everything that composure had spent 2 years keeping carefully out of sight. The full and complicated truth of her, the love that had begun in a garden and survived grief and silence and the long discipline of decency, and was standing here now finally in the light. The years that followed were, in the best possible sense, ordinary, not empty of difficulty. No real life is, but ordinary in the way of a life that has been built on honest ground, where the difficulties are met by two people who face the same direction and have learned, through the specific education of their particular history, not to mistake silence for distance or composure for coldness. The Blackthorn estate became, under Rosemary's gradual influence, more alive than it had been in years. The gardens were transformed over time with the patient vision of someone who understands that good things take longer than expected and are worth the wait. The library was reorganized to a standard that Theodore privately considered excessive and publicly considered perfect. The house filled over time with the specific warmth of a place that is genuinely inhabited. Books left open on tables, flowers brought in from the garden, the sound of a particular piece of music played imperfectly and persistently on the pianoforte in the East Room until it was played perfectly, and then abandoned for the next challenge. There were children, 3 of them over the course of several years, who inherited in varying combinations their father's deliberateness and their mother's precision, and who grew up in a house where love was not performed for the benefit of observers, but simply practiced daily and without fanfare, in the language of 2 people who had waited a long time to say everything they meant and had never since been willing to say anything less. Rosemary kept a garden at Blackthorn that became, in the county, quietly famous, not for its size or its spectacle, but for its particular quality of considered beauty, the sense one had walking through it that every decision had been made with real feeling and real thought. People who visited the estate remembered the garden long after they had forgotten the dinner conversation. She considered this an acceptable form of legacy. Theodore, in his later years, was known as a man of unusual integrity, in a world not always structured to reward it. Someone who had held certain positions and certain principles without compromise, and who had been, in the long accounting that such things eventually receive, on the right side of more of the important questions than most. He considered this less an achievement than a reasonable minimum. What neither of them ever spoke about publicly, but both understood privately as the single most defining fact of their shared life, was this: that the most important decision either of them had ever made had been, in both cases, the decision not to act. The discipline of those 2 years, the dinners and the drawing rooms and the long winter evenings and the careful, absolute maintenance of every necessary line, had not been a loss. It had been a foundation, the thing that made everything built upon it worth having. On an October evening, some years after the spring wedding in the estate chapel, Rosemary was walking in the garden at the hour when the light does what it had always done in October at Blackthorn, that warm, amber, unhurried thing that made everything look like it meant something. She was walking the path that led to the lake, the path she had walked the first time she had ever come to this estate, when she had been a young woman in a borrowed future who had stepped outside for air and found something she had not been looking for. Theodore found her there by the lake, where the willows were doing their slow autumnal thinning, and the water held the sky's last light like something kept in trust. He came to stand beside her without speaking, which was, after all these years, entirely sufficient. They stood together in the amber light in the garden where everything had begun, with a conversation between 2 strangers who had not known each other's names, looking at a lake that had been looking back at people for considerably longer than either of them, and intended to go on doing so long after. After a while she said, "Do you remember what you were thinking about that afternoon when I found you here?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave everything. "I was thinking," he said, "that I had been away too long, and that I had forgotten what the place actually felt like, and that I ought to come home more often." She was quiet for a moment. "And then I interrupted you," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I'm sorry." He looked at her, and in his expression was everything that 2 decades of a shared life had deposited there, the humor and the depth and the absolute bedrock certainty of a man who knows, without any remaining possibility of doubt, that his life is exactly where it ought to be. "No," he said, "you are not." She smiled, the real one, the brief and unguarded one that changed her whole face and had been from the first time he saw it across a candlelit dinner table, the most beautiful thing in any room it appeared in. "No," she agreed, "I'm not." The light settled over the garden, over the lake, over the old oaks and the willow and the stone path worn smooth by a century of feet that had all, in their time, walked through this place and carried their particular human weight of love and grief and hope, and the ordinary, extraordinary effort of a life honestly lived. The wood pigeon, somewhere in the trees behind them, offered its final observation of the evening. They stood together in the fading light, and they were home. The end, and so ends the story of Rosemary Whitfield and Duke Theodore Blackthorn. A love born in a garden, tested by honor, and freed at last by the quiet grace of time. If this story found a place in your heart, my dear friends, I would be so truly grateful if you would take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you never miss a new story. Leave me a comment below. Tell me which moment moved you most, because I read every single word you write to me. Give this video a like if it brought you something, and please turn on your notifications so we can keep meeting like this. And if you feel in your heart the desire to support this little channel of ours and help me keep bringing these stories to life, the support link is right there in the first pinned comment below. Every single gesture of support means more than I can say. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take very good care of yourselves, dear friends.